Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I am here today at Ars Mechanica, the FN Browning Group Foundation responsible for curating the history and heritage of all the brands of the group dating back to 1885. So, as you might expect, they have a pretty cool reference collection, and today, from that collection, we have pulled out the very first FAL. It is actually FAL number 1. It is chambered for 8 by 33 millimeter Kurz. That is the German Sturmgewehr cartridge, and it is literally this rifle that started the entire FAL program. So we're going to take a look at it today. We're going to take it apart. It's going to be very cool. And let's begin with where this story begins, which is basically the summer of 1941, when 5 of the major players from FN successfully evacuate themselves out of German-occupied Belgium to the United Kingdom. There's a bit of a funny story involved. Logistics don't work out, and they all get passports, fake passports, with the same name. Fortunately, at the border, they had bribed the right people, and they were able to get through anyway, but probably a very close call there that had some people sweating. At any rate, these 5 gentlemen include Gustave Jossard, who was the managing director of FN at the time, as well as the company's chief engineer, chief firearms designer, the very notable Dieudonne Saive. Saive, of course, he was John Browning's protege, and he is responsible for essentially the FN high power, the FN FAL. So a lot of really good work. He's one of the particularly notable firearms designers of the 20th century. His assistant, one René Leleu, also escaped with him, and 2 other basically significant players from FN. Anyway, they get over to the UK where they continue working on small arms development in close association with the British military. And what this would do is help form some bonds that really assisted in the rebuilding of FN after World War II. So in particular, Saive worked on what the British would tinker with for several years as the SLEM, the self-loading experimental model. When Saive comes back to FN after the war, he continues working on that project sort of as a separate side branch of it. At one point, the project splits into the British version and the Belgian version. Well, the Belgian version becomes the FN-49, which becomes this rifle, but I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Because of these close associations, in 1946, FN is invited to take part in the British Combat Infantry Weapons System, the Infantry Combat Weapons Replacement Program. The British know that their SMLE, well, their number 4 now, Lee Enfields, are definitely obsolete. They need some sort of self-loading rifle. They've been tinkering with some things like the SLEM, but they're going to have a formal program now to do it. And there was a lot of interest in the German Sturmgewehr cartridge and the idea of an intermediate caliber rifle that can actually be fired accurately from the shoulder in full auto, which is what the Germans were able to essentially be the first military to do with the Sturmgewehr. Now, the British have captured a bunch of Sturmgewehrs. They've done a bunch of testing. The cooperation and collaboration between FN and the British means that the FN staff have access to a lot of this information. And in September of 1946, when FN is invited to participate in this program, Saive starts working on a carbine in 8mm Kurz. In fact, actually, he first starts by making a ballistic test barrel for 8mm Kurz, using a lot of the background information that he has thanks to the British. He spends about 2 months working on that, and in December of 1947, sets out on building a rifle, specifically this rifle. Not even like this model, but this particular rifle. It takes a little under a year, and in November of 1947, this is all ready to go. Now, it is fundamentally based on like a slightly scaled down version of the rifle that he developed during the war, the British SLEM, or the FN-49. Now, at the time, this rifle stayed in development as the FN-49. There's a lot of, I think, curiosity about why was FN selling a fixed magazine, stripper clip loaded semi-automatic rifle in essentially the same caliber as the FAL at the same time as the FAL in the early 1950s. The answer is originally the FN-49 was the full power rifle, so replacement for a standard infantry bolt action, and the universal carbine, this guy, was supposed to be sort of a replacement for the submachine gun. It was the new assault rifle concept, and it was differentiated by using an intermediate caliber cartridge, specifically here the 8x33 Kurz. This would be a very nice controllable rifle. It fires, depending on the gas setting, between 500 and 600 rounds per minute. I am sure this thing would be fantastic to shoot. But this is a very different sort of rifle from the FN-49, and in that context, it's understandable why both existed side by side. Now, of course, later, this rifle ends up increasing in size to 7.62 NATO, at which point it really is, there's no reason to buy an FN-49 when you have a production level FAL. So that's when the FN-49 goes away. But I'm getting sidetracked here a bit. So November of 1947, this rifle is complete. It is tested just a few weeks later in January at Zoetendaal, which is one of the ammunition testing facilities here in Belgium. The FN designers demonstrate it to a couple of British officers who are sufficiently impressed with its performance that they arrange for it to be tested at Enfield in April of 1948. And that testing is the one place where this rifle really got a good documented test. They put it up against a set of really good comparable rifles, comparable guns. They have it set against a Sten gun, an American M2 carbine, so a full auto 30 caliber carbine, a German Sturmgewehr, actually I think two different German Sturmgewehrs, and this rifle. And that trial is where this rifle really got a good workup. It wasn't subjected to a serious, huge burn down endurance test, but it did undergo accuracy testing and reliability testing and a sand test and a few other not insignificant tests. And it came out performing really quite well. It was reliable, it was handy, and perhaps most importantly, it proved that it was indeed possible to have a fully automatic shoulder-fired weapon that was actually controllable by virtue of using an intermediate caliber cartridge like 8x33. So let's dive into this. Let me show you the details. Let's take it apart, and then we'll talk about why this is the only one that was ever made. All right, this thing barely fits fully into frame here. This is like sort of like the uncanny valley of FALs. There are a lot of elements that you will recognize from the modern FAL or from the later mass production FAL, but also a whole bunch of little elements that are subtly different. So let's dive in. Let's start with taking a look at the markings. On the receiver here, we have the full manufacturer's name, Fabrique Nationale d'Armes de Guerre, Herstal, Belgique. We then have a series of Liège, Belgian Liège proof marks there. So this is a gun that was fully proofed. And then we have a nice fancy FN logo engraved on the top of the receiver and the serial number, which is 1. All right, a few features here. The end of the muzzle is threaded. This was designed for a detachable optional bipod that was mounted all the way out of the muzzle. And you can actually see that in use in one of the British testing photos. By the way, this is a full-length barrel, essentially. It's a little over 19-inch barrel, 490 millimeters. The rifle itself weighs in at 8.6 pounds, or about 3.8 kilograms. So it's not really that much handier or that much lighter than a typical, like a normal rifle. This is kind of like a full-size FAL, just chambered for a small cartridge. Sorry, let the gun drift out there as I'm rambling. Okay, a couple features here are pretty distinctive. The charging handle is up on the left side of the gas tube, positioned very much like an AK charging handle, although it does not have a lock open feature in the handle itself like HK does. This locks open on a hold open tab in the magazine. Our front sight kind of looks like what you would expect from a later FAL. We've got these two protector wings, although interestingly the sight itself is located in the front of those wings instead of in the center. And then on the front, we have an adjustable gas port. So you push in that plunger and you can rotate this plug to adjust the amount of gas pressure you get. That's something that would remain pretty fundamental to the FAL. Different versions have different types of adjustment or different number of adjustment settings, but the adjustable gas system is a key ingredient that would remain on the gun. All right, if I zoom out here a bit, I can demonstrate the charging handle. So it is non-reciprocating. It has its own recoil spring, so it will snap back into place. The bolt does lock open on an empty mag. So of course this does not use Sturmgewehr magazines. It does have the controls that we would expect from a modern FAL. So mag release button offset on the right here, and a bolt hold open lever, which if I pull it down, will drop the bolt. That's on the left side. This is not a rock-in magazine. It is a straight press-in magazine. Of course, chambered for 8 Kurz. Nice little short cartridge. We've got the magazine locking tab there, hold open tab on the back of the follower. Just for comparison's sake, here is a later standard 7.62 caliber FAL magazine. So you can see the very substantial difference in length, but the overall design is pretty much the same. The locking tab's the same, the hold open tab's basically the same. By the way, this, I'm not sure exactly what the capacity is. The British Trials report says 20 rounds. This looks too short to me to hold 20 rounds of 8 Kurz. I suspect this is 15. That doesn't mean they didn't have 20 round magazines in the British testing, just this particular example I think is a little bit shorter. All right, the rear sight here is an important and distinctive feature that we definitely need to take a look at. It is an aperture rear sight. It is a folding rear sight, so it flips down like that when not in use. There's the rear sight, the aperture hole itself. And then the whole thing is mounted on a tangent leaf that is graduated up to 500 meters. Over on this side, you can see we've got sort of what would become a distinctive FAL pattern where the magazine well is full length on one side, but sort of cut back on the other. We've got a 3-position selector here, safe, repetition, and automatic. And this is one of the early elements of the FAL. You'll see this just on the very early trials guns, this and also some of the 280s, where there's actually an inspection or maintenance plate here on the side held in place by the selector lever. Now, unfortunately, or fortunately, this particular example is a really fantastic condition gun that is really tight. So I'm not going to be able to do as much disassembly as I would like, because I don't want to break out the hammer to start wailing on things to get them free. However, I'm going to show you this on a different gun. Here is one of the later 280 caliber examples. And on this one, this is exactly the same mechanism that the 8mm gun has. Once you pull out the selector lever, you can pull off this witness plate, and you can actually see the workings of the fire control mechanism in there. So if you need to inspect anything or replace anything, this makes it easier than having to like pull pins out and then work through the top of the lower receiver. So we have that mechanism here. And by the way, you access it by lifting the selector lever to the vertical position, which you cannot do when the gun is assembled, so it can't come out accidentally. In order to open up the gun, we have an early version of the FAL disassembly lever. You may be more used to the early and late production patterns. This one, you have to pull this thing all the way down to here, and then, there we go. Like I said, this one's a very tight gun still. So right there is the locking lug that we open up with that lever. We've got a fire control group inside here that has a long plunger with the firing pins, or the hammer spring inside it. Now I can actually lift this to the vertical position, just past vertical, and I can pull the selector lever out, but this plate is very firmly in place and would require a pry bar to get out. So we're gonna leave that alone. With this open, I can now pull out our bolt and carrier, and then we have a sheet metal top cover, which attaches into a pair of grooves in the upper receiver, just like a modern production FAL. And once again, I apologize, this is in there so snug and tight that I would have to get a hammer to start trying to open it up, and I don't want to do that to this gun. So we're going to leave that in that state of assembly. Same thing applies for pulling the lower off. This screw comes out, but then it's just too tight for me to get out easily, and I don't want to damage it. But I can show you the bolt and carrier here. So this is just like the standard FAL that we were used to seeing in production. So I can actually push this out hit with the tail of the bolt carrier, get it started there, and this pin comes out, and there's our spring-loaded firing pin. This has a tilting bolt, so that's the locking surface. It's going to ride in a very standard looking, if slightly shorter than we're used to, bolt carrier. So when the bolt carrier is traveling, the bolt is in this forward position, unlocked. When it comes all the way forward into battery, the bolt face is going to hit the barrel and stop. The bolt carrier continues forward, and a cam lug inside the bolt carrier there pushes the back end of the bolt down, where this surface locks into a recess right up here in the upper receiver so that it can fire. The tail here, just like a modern FAL, connects to this plunger right here, and the recoil spring, it goes down into the stock itself. So that tail is just there so that as a connection between the bolt carrier and the recoil spring back here. So there you go. There is FAL number 1 in 8mm Kurz field stripped. I apologize that I can't take this one apart any further for you, but hopefully I think we've covered the most significant elements of it here, because mechanically this remained pretty much the same through standard FAL production, just with, of course, stretching of the receiver a bit to accommodate the full power 7.62 NATO cartridge by the end of development, and of course refining some of the details. So to refresh your memory, in April of 1948, this rifle is tested against a number of relatively comparable guns and comes out looking really good. In fact, it comes out looking good enough that the British go ahead and order 2 more of them for further testing. However, during this time, there are other branches of the British military that are working on the new small arms development project. And there is a committee set up to determine what cartridge to use, because if you, say, adopt a carbine in 8mm Kurz, you're going to need a machine gun using a different cartridge, because your support machine guns need to be in a heavier cartridge for better long-range performance. What the British committee ends up deciding is that they're going to go with a full power rifle cartridge on the lower end of the power spectrum as a universal cartridge for rifles and machine guns, and that is the 280 cartridge at the time. It's 7x49mm. I think there is some confusion. There are some people who think that this early British cartridge was an intermediate cartridge, and it's really not. It is a full power rifle cartridge, but it happens to be at the lower end of the spectrum of power of full auto rifle cartridges. If you consider the 280, the 7x49, to be an intermediate cartridge, you would also have to consider, for example, the 6.5 Carcano and the 6.5 Japanese as being intermediate caliber cartridges, which they really aren't. Now, the 280 was still a pretty good cartridge for a rifle. It was a decent balance of power and controllability, but it really didn't have that actual full auto shoulder controllability that a true intermediate like 8 Kurz or like 30 carbine, or skipping forward a few decades, like 5.56 would have. 7.62x39, also comparable to this sort of layout. So carbines serial number 2 and 3 follow this basic design, but they are scaled up just slightly to 280 in what would prove to be the first of a series of slow increases in power of this rifle until eventually we end up at the end with the 7.62mm NATO cartridge. So that has been a bit of a long video, but a very cool opportunity to take a look at a literal one-of-a-kind, the only 8mm Kurz FAL ever officially produced. So I'd like to give a very big thank you to the FN Browning Group and Ars Mechanica specifically for giving me access to this absolute unicorn of a rifle to film and show to you guys. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.